That day started like any other in the quiet suburban neighborhood. The sun was shining, kids were riding their bikes up and down the street, and the air was filled with the sounds of life carrying on. But no one could have predicted the storm brewing just around the corner, a moment that would send ripples far beyond what anyone there could imagine. Sheila Carter was on her way home, a quick stop at the local grocery store behind her. She was the kind of woman you'd notice, not just because of her striking presence, but because of her energy. Confident, poised, and deeply respected in the community, she had this way of walking into a room and owning it without even trying. But Sheila wasn't thinking about all that. Her mind was on dinner plans and the long day ahead. The parking lot was busy, as usual, cars weaving in and out while people hurried to finish their errands. Sheila loaded her groceries into the back seat, her phone buzzing with a text from her husband. "Don't forget dessert," he'd written. She smiled. Typical Marcus, always thinking about the sweet stuff. Little did she know that this ordinary moment would soon turn into something extraordinary. She just closed the car door when she heard the voice. "Ma'am, excuse me. I need you to step back." It was sharp, authoritative, and loud enough to catch the attention of those nearby. Sheila turned around to see a police officer approaching, his expression tight and serious. His nameplate read, Officer Daniels. He looked frustrated, maybe even a little angry, as if whatever had happened earlier that day had already pushed him to his limit. Sheila was confused. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked calmly, instinctively pulling herself up straighter. But instead of explaining himself, Daniels got closer, too close. "License and registration," he snapped, his hand hovering near his belt. Sheila frowned. What was this about? She hadn't even been driving. She'd been loading groceries, for crying out loud. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand," she replied, her voice steady but firm. Her natural confidence wasn't something she turned off easily, especially when things didn't feel right. That seemed to irk him. "I said step back!" Daniels barked again, his tone harsher now, drawing a small crowd. Sheila could feel the eyes on her, whispers beginning to ripple through the air. She wasn't one to cause a scene, but this was escalating far too quickly for no apparent reason. "Officer, with all due respect, can you tell me what's going on?" she asked again, refusing to back down. What happened next was so fast, so shocking, it felt unreal. Daniels, visibly irritated, raised his voice even more, and then, just like that, his hand shot out, shoving Sheila backward. The move was aggressive, unnecessary, and completely out of line. Gasps echoed from the small crowd. "Whoa, what's going on here?" someone shouted. Another pulled out their phone, the telltale red light blinking as they began to record. But it didn't end there. Sheila, stumbling from the shove, barely had time to catch her balance before Daniels made another move, a fist swinging toward her shoulder, then grazing her jaw. It wasn't a full punch, but it was enough. Enough to make everyone watching freeze. Enough to make Sheila's blood run cold. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Daniels stood there, breathing heavily, while Sheila raised her hand to her face, her mind racing. The crowd was no longer whispering. They were shouting now. "Call someone! This is wrong! She didn't even do anything!" The sound of outrage was growing louder, but Daniels didn't seem to notice, or maybe he didn't care. But what he definitely didn't know was who Sheila's husband was. The man behind the text, the one asking for dessert, wasn't just anyone. Marcus Carter wasn't just a loving husband and father. He was a man who commanded respect, a man with connections that reached far and wide, and someone who didn't take threats to his family lightly. Sheila didn't say a word as Daniel stood there, his face a mix of defiance and uncertainty as he realized he was being filmed. Her silence wasn't out of fear. It was calculated. Her husband would handle this. And when he did, Daniels was in for a shock he couldn't possibly prepare for. By now, people were stepping in, trying to de-escalate. "Sir, you need to calm down," one man said to Daniels, who was clearly losing control of the situation. But it was too late. The damage was done. Sheila took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her phone. She didn't care about the crowd or the cameras anymore. She had one number to call, and she knew exactly what to say. The phone rang twice before Marcus picked up. "Hey, babe, everything okay?" She paused, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Not really," she replied. But don't worry, you'll want to see this for yourself. Marcus Carter didn't need a lot of words to know something was wrong. The tone in Sheila's voice was enough. His calm demeanor shifted instantly, his mind racing as he tried to piece together what could have happened. Sheila wasn't one to exaggerate or call him unless it was important. And the way she said, "You'll want to see this for yourself," sent a chill down his spine. "Where are you?" he asked, his voice low but tense. Sheila gave him the location, her words clipped but steady. Marcus didn't ask anything else. He just said, "I'm on my way," and hung up. He was already moving, grabbing his keys and heading out the door. Marcus wasn't just her husband. He was her protector, her partner in every sense of the word. And when it came to Sheila, there was no such thing as overreacting. Back at the scene, things were escalating. The crowd had grown larger, and more phones were recording now, catching every detail of the interaction. Sheila stood still, her eyes locked on Officer Daniels. She wasn't afraid, but she was angry. Angry that this man had disrespected her, laid his hands on her, and acted like he could get away with it. Daniels, on the other hand, was starting to look uneasy. He'd underestimated her. He could see that now. The confidence in her stance, the way she wasn't cowering or backing down, was throwing him off. And the growing crowd wasn't helping. "Move along, people. This is official police business," he barked, but no one listened. If anything, his tone only made them more defiant. "She didn't even do anything," a young woman shouted from the back of the group. "You're way out of line, officer," another man chimed in. Daniels glanced around, his jaw tightening. He was losing control of the situation, and he knew it. Sheila didn't flinch, didn't let him see even a flicker of fear. Instead, she calmly lifted her phone and began recording him too. Her hands were steady now, her voice clear as she said, "You have no right to touch me. You know that, right? This is going to be documented." Daniels glared at her, but he didn't respond. He was caught, and he knew it. Marcus was driving like a man on a mission, his mind racing. Marcus Carter wasn't just any husband. He was a man who had spent years building his reputation, earning respect not just in his community, but far beyond. A retired Marine, now a successful entrepreneur, Marcus had connections that reached deep into law enforcement, politics, and the legal world. He wasn't someone you wanted to cross, especially when it came to his family. As he weaved through traffic, he thought about Sheila. He knew she could handle herself. She always could. That was one of the things he loved most about her. But the thought of someone mistreating her, especially in such a public and humiliating way, made his blood boil. When he finally arrived at the scene, the first thing he saw was the crowd. It wasn't small anymore. At least 20 people were standing around, their phones up, their voices carrying through the air. Marcus parked quickly and stepped out, his broad shoulders and commanding presence immediately catching attention. He didn't need to say a word. People just moved out of his way as he walked toward Sheila. "Babe," he said, his voice calm but firm. Sheila turned to him, relief washing over her face for just a moment. "Marcus," she said softly, her eyes meeting his. She didn't need to explain anything. He could see it all. The way she stood, the way the officer was glaring at her, and the way the crowd was buzzing with anger and disbelief. Daniels noticed Marcus too, and something about him immediately made the officer tense. Marcus wasn't yelling or making a scene, but his presence was enough to shift the energy in the air. He walked straight to Sheila and placed a protective hand on her shoulder. "Are you okay?" he asked, his tone quiet but loaded with meaning. "I'm fine," Sheila replied, though Marcus could see the way her jaw tightened as she spoke. That small movement told him everything he needed to know. She wasn't fine. But she was holding it together. Marcus turned his attention to Daniels, his gaze steady and unflinching. "What's the problem here, officer?" he asked, his voice calm, but carrying an edge that made it clear he wasn't asking for small talk. Daniels hesitated, his earlier bravado faltering. "This is a private matter, sir," he said, trying to regain control of the situation. "Private?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Doesn't look private to me. Looks like you've got half the neighborhood watching." He gestured to the crowd, which was still recording every second. "So why don't you go ahead and explain yourself?" Daniel's face flushed, and for a moment, he seemed to weigh his options. He could try to stand his ground, but something about Marcus made him hesitate. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, or the quiet authority in his voice, or maybe it was the realization that he'd picked the wrong fight this time. She was being uncooperative, Daniel said finally, though his voice lacked the conviction it had earlier. Uncooperative? Marcus repeated, his tone sharp. Uncooperative how? By asking questions? By standing in a parking lot? He took a small step closer, his eyes never leaving Daniel's. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you were the one out of line. Daniels opened his mouth to respond, but Marcus wasn't finished. You put your hands on my wife. You shoved her. You hit her. And now you're trying to act like she's the problem? His voice didn't rise, but the intensity behind his words was impossible to ignore. The crowd murmured in agreement, their voices growing louder. Yeah, tell him, someone shouted. This is ridiculous, another added. Daniels was visibly rattled now. He glanced around, realizing that the situation was spiraling further out of his control. But before he could say anything else, Marcus pulled out his phone. Don't worry, Marcus said, his voice low but cutting. I've got friends who will want to see this. People who will make sure you answer for what you did here today. He began dialing a number, his eyes never leaving Daniel's. Sheila watched silently, her heart pounding. She knew Marcus was in his element now, calm, strategic, and unrelenting. And she knew Daniels had no idea who he was dealing with. As Marcus spoke into the phone, the crowd watched, their cameras still rolling. Daniels stood frozen, his face pale as he realized this was far from over. Sheila glanced at Marcus, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing at the corner of her lips. This was just the beginning. The air was thick with tension, every breath heavy with the weight of what was unfolding. The crowd wasn't going anywhere. In fact, it was growing. People who had just been passing by were stopping to see what all the commotion was about. Some whispered to each other, piecing together what they'd overheard, while others openly voiced their anger and disbelief. The officer's uniform, meant to command respect, now felt like a symbol of overreach to everyone watching. Marcus finished his call, his voice steady as he spoke into the phone, but the look in his eyes was anything but calm. He slid the phone back into his pocket and turned his full attention back to Officer Daniels. The man looked uneasy, sweat starting to bead on his forehead despite the mild weather. He wasn't used to this kind of pushback, especially from someone like Marcus, a man who wasn't just standing up to him, but was commanding the entire situation without raising his voice. Daniels glanced at Sheila, then back at Marcus. Sir, I suggest you step back, he said, trying to sound authoritative. But his voice wavered slightly, betraying his uncertainty. Marcus didn't flinch. Instead, he took a deliberate step closer, his imposing frame towering over the officer. Step back? He repeated, his tone sharp but measured. You think I'm the one who needs to step back? You're the one who crossed the line. You put your hands on my wife! My wife! His voice cracked just slightly on the last word, the raw emotion cutting through the air like a blade. Sheila placed a hand gently on Marcus's arm, grounding him. Marcus, she said softly, her voice calm but firm. I'm fine. Let's just handle this the right way. She wasn't trying to calm him down because she thought he was overreacting. She knew he wasn't. But she also knew how easily situations like this could spiral out of control, and she didn't want to give Daniels any more ammunition to twist the narrative. The crowd murmured again, their phones still pointed at the scene. Every word, every movement was being documented. It was a powerful reminder that this wasn't just about Sheila and Marcus anymore. This was about something bigger, accountability, justice, and the deep cracks in a system that allowed moments like this to happen in the first place. Daniels' radio crackled, breaking the tension for a split second. He reached for it, mumbling something into the receiver before turning his attention back to Marcus and Sheila. His hands were fidgeting now, his composure slipping further. He wasn't sure how to regain control, and it showed. You don't understand who you're dealing with, Daniels said suddenly, his tone defensive. It was a weak attempt to assert dominance, but it only made him sound desperate. Marcus's lips curled into a small, humorless smile. No, he said quietly. You don't understand who you're dealing with. That sentence hung in the air like a thundercloud. Daniels shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the growing crowd. He could feel the tide turning against him, but he wasn't ready to back down. Not yet. His pride wouldn't let him. Meanwhile, Sheila noticed a familiar face in the crowd. It was Terrence, a local journalist who'd been covering issues of police misconduct for years. He was standing off to the side, his camera rolling and his sharp eyes taking in every detail. Sheila caught his gaze, and he gave her a small nod, silently reassuring her that he was there and paying attention. That small gesture gave her a renewed sense of strength. As the standoff continued, a black SUV pulled into the parking lot, its tinted windows gleaming under the afternoon sun. The vehicle moved slowly, deliberately, before coming to a stop a few feet away from the crowd. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out, dressed in a sharp navy suit and exuding authority with every step. It was Raymond Ellis, a high-ranking official in the local government and a longtime friend of Marcus. Sheila had met him a few times before, and she knew he wasn't someone who showed up unless the situation demanded it. "Ray?" Marcus said, his voice lighter for the first time since he'd arrived. The two men exchanged a brief handshake, their interaction a stark contrast to the charged atmosphere around them. Raymond's eyes swept over the scene, taking in Daniels, the crowd, and Sheila. "Marcus called me," he said, his tone calm but firm. "What's going on here?" Daniels hesitated, his earlier bravado completely gone now. "This is a misunderstanding," he stammered. "She was being uncooperative, and I had to step in." "She was being uncooperative?" Raymond repeated, raising an eyebrow. "And that justified putting your hands on her?" His tone was polite, almost disarmingly so, but there was an edge to it that made Daniels shift uncomfortably. Before Daniels could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "Excuse me, but I saw everything." It was the young woman from earlier, the one who had shouted at Daniels. She stepped forward, her phone still recording. "She didn't do anything wrong. This guy just started yelling at her out of nowhere, and when she didn't back down, he shoved her. Then he hit her." Her voice cracked slightly at the end, the emotion behind her words evident. Daniels opened his mouth to argue, but the crowd erupted in agreement, their voices drowning him out. "That's right! We all saw it! He went too far!" The tide had fully turned now, and Daniels was visibly panicking. Raymond held up a hand, silencing the crowd. "Thank you," he said to the young woman, his tone warm but firm. Then he turned back to Daniels. "I think it's time you start answering some questions, Officer Daniels." Daniels' face was pale, his eyes darting between Marcus, Sheila, and Raymond. He looked like a man trapped, desperately searching for a way out. But there was no escape now. Marcus stepped forward again, his voice steady but loaded with meaning. "This isn't over," he said quietly, his eyes locked on Daniels. "Not by a long shot." And for the first time, Daniels didn't say anything, because deep down, he knew Marcus was right. The crowd was getting louder, the air thick with a restless energy that felt like it could ignite at any moment. Every phone in the crowd was trained on Officer Daniels, recording every second of the tense standoff. The situation was spiraling, and Daniels knew it. He glanced around, looking for someone to help him, but no one was coming to his aid. There was no backup, no one to pull him out of this mess. Just a sea of faces staring at him, waiting for him to crack. Marcus stood unmoving, his posture strong and unyielding. Sheila was next to him, her arms crossed, eyes steady. She wasn't going to back down, and neither was he. There was no going back from this moment. Not for Daniels, not for any of them. Raymond, still calm as ever, took a step forward. He didn't need to raise his voice. His presence alone was enough to make Daniels falter. "You're going to have to answer for this," he said softly, but the weight behind his words was impossible to ignore. Daniels wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, his breath shallow and quick. He knew the game was up, but he couldn't let go of the desperate hope that somehow something might shift. That maybe, just maybe, someone would back him up. But the crowd wasn't on his side anymore, and neither was his own conscience. He had crossed a line, and everyone knew it. "Officer," Raymond continued, his voice steady as he pulled out his phone, "you've lost control here. This is no longer about your authority. It's about your actions. You hurt someone today. You need to explain yourself." The officer's face flushed a deep red, his eyes darting to Sheila, then to Marcus, and finally landing on Raymond. "I didn't," he began, but his words caught in his throat. What could he say? There was nothing left to defend himself with. He had lost all semblance of control. He was a man standing in the middle of a storm, and he had no way out. But it wasn't just Daniels who was on edge. Sheila could feel it too. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife, and the crowd was waiting for something to happen. Their phones were still recording, capturing every second of this spectacle. Sheila could almost hear the whir of the cameras as people held their breath, waiting for the next move. She glanced at Marcus. His jaw clenched, his eyes cold. He hadn't moved a muscle since Raymond had arrived, but she could see the storm inside him brewing. He was calm on the surface, but beneath it, a deep fury was building. Not just for what had happened to her, but for the way Daniels had treated him as well. This wasn't just about one incident. It was about everything that had led up to this moment. It was about the years of abuse, the power imbalances, and the deep-seated injustice that ran through the system like a river of poison. Sheila stepped forward slightly, her voice cutting through the tension. "What are you going to do, officer?" she asked, her tone quiet but filled with a quiet strength. "Are you just going to stand there and pretend this didn't happen? You put your hands on me. You hit me. There's no excuse for that." The crowd murmured again, some voices rising in agreement, others filled with disbelief. Sheila's words had struck a chord with everyone who had been watching, and now the weight of the moment was settling over them all. Daniels took a step back, his mind racing. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The silence hung in the air, pregnant with anticipation. He could feel the eyes on him, the weight of the crowd's judgment pressing down. They weren't just watching anymore. They were waiting. They were waiting for him to break, for him to show his true colors. And he could feel it. He was on the edge, about to snap. Marcus took a slow, deliberate step forward, his presence commanding, suffocating. "I think you need to answer for what you did," he said, his voice low and controlled. There was a finality to his words, a sense that the moment of reckoning was coming, and Daniels had nowhere to hide. The officer flinched, a nervous tick in his eye, but he didn't move. He was trapped, surrounded by the weight of his own actions and the gaze of every person in the crowd. And yet, in that moment, it was as if everything had slowed down. Time itself seemed to stretch, and for a brief second, he wasn't sure if he could face the consequences of his choices. Raymond glanced at Marcus, then at Daniels, his eyes sharp. "This won't end well for you," he said, his voice carrying an edge that made everyone in earshot pause. "You've crossed the line, and now you're going to have to deal with it. There are people who will make sure of that." Daniels swallowed hard, his throat dry. He looked from Raymond to Marcus, then to Sheila, and for the first time, he seemed to realize the magnitude of what he'd done. He wasn't just dealing with an upset citizen anymore. He was standing in front of people who would make this much bigger than it ever had a chance of being. The air was electric now. The crowd was waiting for something to happen, waiting for the final confrontation, the breaking point. Daniels was caught in a whirlwind of regret, fear, and disbelief. He had made a mistake, and there was no turning back. And then, just when it seemed like everything might come to a head, a voice broke through the tension. "Is there a problem here, officer?" The voice was calm, measured, but with an unmistakable authority that seemed to immediately shift the energy in the air. Everyone turned, their attention now focused on the newcomer, a tall, commanding figure who had just arrived on the scene. His presence seemed to draw all eyes to him, and for a moment, it felt like the entire world paused. The man who had spoken was dressed in a crisp suit, his face stern but not unkind. His eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the scene with a practiced gaze. The moment he spoke, everyone fell silent, their collective breath held. Daniel's eyes widened, his face paling. He knew this man. Everyone did. This wasn't just anyone. This was someone who could change everything. And in that instant, it became clear. The game had just changed. The crowd stood in stunned silence as the newcomer took a step forward, his presence almost magnetic. It was as if the entire parking lot shifted with him, like the atmosphere had just changed, and everything that had been so tightly wound now hung in the balance. The tension was palpable. Daniels's face had gone white, his lips barely moving as he stared at the man with a mixture of recognition and fear. The crowd, already on edge, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. The man in the suit moved closer to Daniels, his eyes never leaving the officer's face. There was no mistaking it now. This wasn't just anyone. This man had power, the kind that could make or break careers with a single word. Marcus, standing just a few feet away, felt a strange sensation crawl down his spine. He wasn't sure whether it was a warning or a promise, but something in the man's eyes suggested that this moment was about to take an even darker turn. "Officer Daniels," the man said, his voice calm but carrying a weight that seemed to settle over the entire scene. "I think it's time for you to explain yourself to the people who actually matter." His tone didn't just command attention. It sliced through the air, sharp and final. Daniels opened his mouth, but the words got stuck in his throat. He was cornered. No escape now, not with this man in front of him. But before he could speak, the newcomer glanced at Marcus, his gaze lingering for just a moment longer than necessary. Marcus could feel the undercurrent of tension, something unspoken yet so clearly evident. "You must be Marcus Carter," the man continued, his voice shifting, a thin smile playing at the edges of his lips. "I've heard a lot about you. We need to talk." Marcus wasn't surprised by the comment. In fact, the man's familiarity with him wasn't entirely new, but it still sent a ripple of unease through his body. There was something about the way the man said it, like it wasn't just a casual remark. Raymond, standing off to the side, shifted his weight, sensing the change in the air. He knew this man too. His name was Walter Gray, and he was as high up the food chain as it got in local politics. But Raymond also knew something else, something that made his stomach churn. Walter Gray wasn't just a politician. He was a man whose influence ran deep. So deep, in fact, that even people in powerful positions feared crossing him. And now here he was, right in the middle of the scene, changing the rules. As Gray's words hung in the air, a knot formed in Marcus's stomach. This wasn't just about an officer's misconduct anymore. No, this was something much bigger. Something that had layers that reached far beyond this parking lot. And Marcus was suddenly aware of how out of control everything was beginning to feel. "I'm not here to play games, Walter," Marcus said, his voice low and firm. He could feel the shift in the atmosphere, and every part of him was telling him that this was about to escalate in ways he hadn't planned for. "This isn't just about you or me, or this officer. This is about accountability. This is about the truth coming out." Walter's smile widened ever so slightly, but there was something in his eyes now, something cold and calculating. "Accountability? Truth?" His voice was almost a whisper, but it carried like a thunderclap through the silence. "You think you're the one who gets to decide what's true, Marcus? You think you can just walk in here, stir up trouble, and walk away untouched?" Marcus's heart raced. He was no fool. He understood what Walter was implying, and it hit him harder than he wanted to admit. Walter's words weren't just a warning. They were a threat, wrapped in layers of power and influence. The whole situation was more than a conflict with a rogue officer. This was a fight against a system, a web of connections that ran far deeper than anything Marcus had ever imagined. Sheila, who had been standing quietly beside Marcus, suddenly stiffened. The weight of the moment was becoming too much to ignore. Her mind raced, connecting dots that hadn't made sense before, and now it felt like the walls were closing in. Walter Gray's arrival wasn't just a coincidence. It was the final piece of the puzzle. The truth was far more complicated than she could have anticipated. "What are you saying, Walter?" Sheila asked, her voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of urgency. "That we should just let this go? That the law doesn't apply to you? To us?" Walter's eyes shifted to Sheila, his expression unreadable. For a moment, everything seemed to pause. The air felt thick, suffocating. And then, with a measured pause, he spoke again, but this time his tone was softer, more ominous. "Sheila, darling, you don't know what you're getting into. Sometimes it's better to let things be." The crowd, already on edge, shifted uneasily. There was a murmur of disbelief, whispers traveling like wildfire through the group. People were starting to get nervous. Nervous because they could feel it too. The rules had changed. This wasn't just a fight against an officer anymore. This was about something much larger, a force that could swallow up everything in its path. Daniels, still standing like a deer in headlights, remained frozen as he absorbed the tension in the air. His hands shook slightly, his back rigid with uncertainty. For all the power he might have held in his uniform, in that moment, he was just a cog in a much larger machine, and it was clear to everyone watching that this machine was beginning to shift gears. "I don't think you understand the situation here," Walter continued, his voice growing softer, almost like he was explaining something to a child. I've spent years building what I have. Everything I've worked for, my position, my influence, my legacy, it's all been carefully constructed. And I don't let people like you threaten that. Do you understand? Marcus clenched his fists, his body tense with the realization of what he was up against. It was bigger than he thought, bigger than he'd been prepared for. He was in the middle of a battle he hadn't signed up for. This wasn't just about one police officer's actions. This was about power, manipulation, and control. Walter Gray had been pulling strings behind the scenes for years, and Marcus was now fully aware that the stakes had just been raised beyond anything he could have imagined. Nothing's going to stop me from exposing what happened today, Marcus said, his voice unwavering despite the fear gnawing at him. He wasn't sure if he believed the words, but he had to say them. You don't control the truth. Not this time. Walter's smile faltered, and for the briefest of moments, there was a flicker of something cold and dangerous in his eyes. Then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced with a steely resolve. He nodded, almost as if conceding something. But it wasn't a victory, it was a warning. I hope you're ready for the consequences, he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, because you're about to find out how deep this goes. And just like that, the air felt even heavier, the stakes even higher. Marcus, Sheila, and everyone around them could feel it. They were standing at the edge of something huge, something they couldn't turn back from. The tension in the air was unbearable. Marcus stood firm, his gaze locked with Walter Gray's, every word, every second, feeling like a potential spark that could set everything off. It had all come down to this moment, the heavy weight of what had happened and what was about to happen, pressing down on them all. The crowd was still, eyes wide, phones recording, knowing this would be the turning point. Walter's smirk remained, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. He had expected Marcus to crumble under the weight of his power, expected the truth to stay buried under layers of influence. But there was something in Marcus, something that refused to back down. Sheila, standing beside him, her presence like a quiet storm, sensed it too. This wasn't just a standoff anymore. This was a reckoning. Raymond had stayed quiet, watching the exchange with an intensity that was almost unnerving. He'd been here before, in situations where power seemed unshakable, and he knew what was at stake. But even he couldn't have anticipated the twist that was coming. I'm not afraid of you, Walter, Marcus finally said, his voice cutting through the silence. You might have your hands in a lot of things, but you don't own the truth, and I'm done hiding from it. He turned slightly, glancing at Sheila, and she gave him a nod, silent but supportive. There was no going back now. Walter took a step closer, his voice low and dangerous. You think you've won? Think again. This isn't over, Marcus, not by a long shot. But as he spoke, something shifted. The air seemed to grow even heavier, more suffocating. And then, without warning, a voice rang out from the back of the crowd. Actually, it is. The voice was firm, confident, surprising everyone, including Walter. Everyone turned to see a tall woman's figure pushing through the crowd. She wasn't anyone Marcus recognized at first, but there was something about the way she carried herself, something sharp and determined. Her eyes, filled with a calm resolve, locked onto Walter with the kind of certainty that made him stiffen immediately. Who are you? Walter's voice faltered for the first time in what seemed like forever. The woman smiled, a cold, calculated smile that didn't reach her eyes. Doesn't matter who I am. What matters is who I know. She reached into her jacket, pulling out a small, neatly folded envelope and holding it out to Walter. The entire crowd was silent, watching the exchange with growing curiosity. Walter's hand twitched, his eyes narrowing as he glanced at the envelope. The color drained from his face. Where did you get that? His voice was almost a whisper now, and the power he'd held so effortlessly seemed to evaporate. The woman didn't answer immediately. She simply handed the envelope to Marcus. The crowd buzzed with whispers, the air charged with anticipation. Marcus opened it slowly, his hands trembling. Inside, there was a single piece of paper, a report, official-looking, stamped with a seal that Marcus knew all too well. It was a file, a dossier, and it was everything. Everything about Walter's illegal dealings, his shady connections, his manipulation of power to cover up corruption. Every word was like a bomb waiting to explode, a revelation that would shake everything to its core. Marcus's voice faltered, but he didn't need to finish the sentence. The damning evidence was right in front of him, and he knew what it meant. This is all the leverage we need. This is how we bring him down. Walter's composure shattered. You can't, you don't understand, he hissed, his breath coming in short gasps. The fear was evident now, something Marcus had never seen in the man before. You don't know who you're dealing with? You think this will stop me? I'll destroy all of you before you even get the chance. But Marcus didn't back down. He held the file high for everyone to see. No, Walter. You are the one who's done now. The crowd erupted into murmurs, people shifting uneasily as the full weight of the situation settled on them. Walter was no longer the untouchable man in power. His carefully built empire, his connections, his influence, all of it was crumbling in front of him. But then, just as it seemed like victory was within reach, Marcus's phone buzzed. He glanced at it briefly and his heart nearly stopped. It wasn't a message from anyone he expected. No, it was a single line of text. They know. They're coming for you. Marcus's eyes widened. Sheila noticed the change in his expression immediately. What is it? She asked, her voice tight with concern. Before Marcus could answer, there was a loud crack. A shot rang out, piercing the air, followed by the sounds of shouting and chaos erupting around them. People screamed, ducking for cover, scattering in all directions. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest as his eyes scanned the crowd, searching for the source of the shot. His mind raced, panic rising. Suddenly, a figure appeared through the smoke of confusion, holding a gun, eyes locked on Marcus with an intensity that felt like death itself. The woman from earlier, the one who had handed over the dossier, was now standing in front of him, holding the weapon steady. You don't get to control this, she said, her voice chillingly cold. Not anymore. You thought this was the end, didn't you? But this is only just beginning. Marcus froze, his heart pounding in his chest. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. In a heartbeat, everything he thought he had gained, everything he had believed in, was slipping away. The stakes had been raised higher than he could have ever imagined. Walter Gray, the man who seemed untouchable, was just a piece of a much larger puzzle. And now, Marcus was standing at the center of it all, realizing that the real battle wasn't about winning, it was about survival. And as the woman leveled the gun at him, the last thing Marcus saw was the cold gleam in her eyes before everything went dark. The world seemed to stop for a moment. Marcus stood frozen, staring at the gun pointed directly at him, his breath shallow and rapid. Everything he had fought for, the truth, the justice, seemed to hang in the balance. He had thought he was about to win, that the evidence he held would be the final blow to Walter Gray's empire. But now, this woman, with her cold eyes and steady hand, had thrown everything into chaos. Don't do this, Marcus said, his voice hoarse, but the desperation was clear. He took a step back, raising his hands slowly, trying to buy himself some time to think, to make sense of what was happening. But the woman didn't flinch. Her finger tightened on the trigger, and Marcus braced himself for what he knew was coming. The loud bang of the gunshot echoed. But instead of hitting him, it was a single shot in the air, shocking everyone into a deeper silence. Out of nowhere, a new figure appeared, stepping into the midst of the chaos. Raymond. He had vanished from the scene moments earlier, but now he was back, and in his hands, he carried a weapon of his own. It wasn't pointed at anyone, but the presence of it was enough to make the woman hesitate. Raymond's voice was steady, his tone commanding. Put the gun down now, he said, his eyes locked on the woman. The threat in his voice was clear, but it was also filled with an underlying calm, as if he had done this 1,000 times before. The woman didn't move, but Marcus could see the flicker of doubt in her eyes. For a brief moment, it seemed like the weight of the situation was too much even for her to handle. Marcus felt a surge of hope. Maybe there was still a chance, a way out of this nightmare. You're making a mistake, Raymond continued, his voice steady but piercing. This isn't how it ends. We can end this peacefully. You don't need to do this. Marcus could see the struggle in the woman's face. Her fingers were still on the gun, but they were shaking now, just slightly. She was clearly caught between her mission and the overwhelming force of Raymond's presence. It was as if the fear she'd carried with her, the tension, was starting to crack. Finally, with a deep sigh, the woman lowered the gun, her face a mixture of frustration and resignation. "You think you've won?" she spat, but there was no venom behind the words anymore. "You think this is the end?" Marcus, still trying to process what was happening, took a careful step forward. "No, it's not the end," he said, his voice clear but calm. "But it can be. If you just tell us who sent you and why you're doing this, we can still make it right. The truth needs to come out." For a moment, there was silence. The only sounds were the distant echoes of sirens, and like the aftermath of a crowd that was slowly starting to dissipate now that the immediate danger had passed. The woman seemed to consider Marcus's words, her expression unreadable. Finally, she let out a long breath and dropped the gun to the ground, stepping away from it. Her eyes met his, and in them, Marcus saw something he hadn't expected: regret. "I was just trying to survive," she said quietly, her voice cracking. "You have no idea what it's like to be stuck in a system that doesn't care about you, to be forced to make choices that you never wanted to make." Marcus's heart sank as he realized the weight of what she was saying. She wasn't just a mercenary or a hired gun. She was a victim, too. A victim of the same system that Walter Gray had built and profited from, the same system that had torn apart the lives of so many, including his own. "What happened to you?" Marcus asked, his voice softer now. "Who made you do this?" The woman shook her head, her eyes dark with pain. "It doesn't matter," she whispered. "All that matters now is what happens next. You have the evidence. You have the power to expose everything. You have to do it before it's too late." Marcus nodded slowly. He understood. This was far bigger than just him, far bigger than just one corrupt officer or one corrupt politician. It was about a system that had allowed greed, fear, and manipulation to thrive for far too long. And if he was going to honor the memory of what he had fought for, he couldn't let it slip away. He had to act. "Don't worry," he said firmly, his voice filled with resolve. "We're going to make sure the truth comes out. No more hiding, no more lies. I promise." Raymond gave him a brief nod, and together they turned toward Walter Gray. The once powerful man was no longer the imposing figure he had been just moments ago. He was crumpled, deflated, his empire hanging by a thread. The power he had once wielded was now slipping through his fingers like sand. The crowd had already begun to disperse, but the truth was out there now, and nothing would silence it. As the sirens drew closer, Walter began to speak, but there was no fire in his voice anymore. He tried to explain himself, to justify his actions, but it was too late. Marcus didn't need to hear his words. He had seen enough. The pieces were already falling into place, the truth coming to light, the system that had allowed corruption to flourish finally starting to crack. The woman who had once held the gun at Marcus's chest stepped back, her eyes full of something new now. There was a flicker of hope, a realization that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for redemption. Marcus couldn't promise her everything, but he could promise her this: the fight wasn't over. It had just begun. As the authorities arrived and took control of the situation, Marcus felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. The battle had been hard fought, the cost high, but the war wasn't won with one victory. This was just the beginning. There would be more fights ahead, more obstacles, more truths to uncover. But in that moment, as the sun began to set on the chaotic scene, Marcus knew that the fight for justice, for truth, would never stop. And perhaps in the end, that was the greatest victory of all.